Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Shana Tova. Welcome to today's session, Revisiting the Sources, Writing on Civil Rights from Heschel to Baldwin to Martin Luther King Jr. with Tema Smith. Please note that this program is being recorded. In Judaism, study is an act of devotion, and we are so pleased to have this opportunity to learn together in community on the afternoon of our highest holy days on the calendar. Before I introduce today's wonderful presenter, I want to take a moment to share a land acknowledgement and then to orient everyone to the functions of Zoom so that today's session runs smoothly. We want to start by acknowledging that the land on which Holy Blossom Temple operates is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Takaranto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Holy Blossom Temple is working towards developing deeper relationships with our Indigenous neighbors to increase our historical understanding and to find new paths to action that will help heal and renew the strengths of the Indigenous communities of this land. We invite you to learn more about the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The link is now in the chat box. You may choose to write to elected officials to encourage greater implementation of these recommendations. If you can see on the slide I currently am sharing, we invite you to rename yourself with your full name, pronouns, and locations. We can get to know each other a little as we go. To rename yourself, as it says, click the top right-hand corner of your own screen and choose rename. Please keep yourself muted at all times. If there's an opportunity to make a comment or ask a question, please mute yourself after. Again, when you finish speaking, we invite you to turn your camera off if you're doing something that may distract other participants. So you can see we've enabled auto captioning for this event. You can choose to view or not view the captions by clicking on the CC icon and choosing View Subtitles on the bottom of the screen. Captions can also be viewable as a live transcript in the sidebar as well as saved. You can choose View as Full Transcript to see the sidebar version. I will be monitoring the chat. You can pose questions to everyone so that Tema and I will see them. You can also message me privately to solve any issues that arise by clicking on the little downward caret beside to everyone in the chat panel and choosing my name. Direct messages are indicated with a red header. If you have any questions or comments, choose the raise hand option under the reaction icon, which should be at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to answer you in order of your hands being raised. Tema will be sharing her screen. So when she does so, if you have the opportunity to enlarge your viewing, you do that by a bar across the top with options, click on View Options, and then find Zoom Ratio to choose the magnification that you desire. Finally, if you want to change your view to see only the speaker, one or more participants, you can toggle between gallery and speaker modes by choosing the View button in the top right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Now it's my great honor to introduce today's teacher, Tema Smith, previously Holy Blossoms Temple's Director of Community Engagement, is a diversity advocate, writer, and Jewish community builder. As a contributing columnist at The Forward, she works to advance the conversation about race and racial justice inside the Jewish community. She speaks frequently on issues of inclusion, justice, and identity, and has been an invited speaker for the ADL, the Jewish Democratic Council of America, Hillel International, Limud North America, the AJC, Harvard University, and numerous synagogues, federations, and JCRCs across North America. She has worked as a consultant with organizations like the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, the Miles Nadal JCC, the Montessori Jewish Day School, and CJPAC. Tema is a member of the Nexus Task Force examining the issues at the intersection of Israel and anti-Semitism in America, and is part of the inaugural cohort of the Shalom Hartman Institute Seminars and Writers' Workshop for Journalists. She is currently the Director of Professional Development at 18 Doors, formerly Interfaith Family, an organization dedicated to empowering people in interfaith relationships to engage in Jewish life and encouraging Jewish communities to welcome them.
It's always weird hearing my own bio. Hi everyone. Hi Howard. Nice to see you. And
Hi, Tema.
I guess everyone's gone to see Chris Hadfield get an award, which is where I would be if I wasn't teaching. But when they asked me to teach, they didn't mention the whole Chris Hadfield award thing. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, we should wait until you've been to outer space because you
Yeah,
deserve a bigger audience, but
yeah,
it's
yeah.
timing
But
is all wrong.
the good news is that this is a topic that I am still workshopping. So every time I get to teach it, it's even better. And the fact that there are less people here means that we can have more interaction, which I can then build into it for the next time I do it. So very
Oh, okay.
excited.
Okay.
The great thing about this topic is that there's just so much to cover. And as always, my source sheet was way more ambitious than we will ever get through. And I had to leave off 3/4 of the things that I wanted to cover. And I'm now realizing that I have like easily a multi-session course that I could build here. So, which is very exciting. And so really what the focus of this today is going to be a little bit of taking a look. Really often we talk a lot about like the sort of the myth, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that just like we have a whole sort of idealized story of how the civil rights movement took place. And, Heschel, of course, was praying with his feet, and King, of course, the arc of time bends towards justice, and all of these sort of biblical and religious allusions that were really about sort of personal forward motion and forward motion of the movement itself. What I actually want to sort of start to do a little bit today is throw out some places where, on the one hand, they saw their work as divinely inspired. Obviously, they were a rabbi and a minister. I also have some James Baldwin as well, as a sort of a different voice of the moment, but show how, on the one hand, they took inspiration from text, but on the other hand, they really used text to, for lack of a better way of putting it, put a mirror to the communities that they were serving and the communities that they were trying to work with. What I have a couple of source sheets that I will share screen, but I also, if it's easier for people just to look at them on Safaria, we're going to start with the King and Baldwin. I will share, but just in case, so right, I have to put the HTTP out, otherwise Zoom doesn't like it. There we go. So this is the first sheet we're going to look at, which is the King and Baldwin. And so really the two themes here are how leaders responded to responded to text, and how leaders also use text. There you all are. I have a new 2-screen setup that I am not very confident with, but it seems to be working just fine, which is great. So I'm going to start with Baldwin. And why I'm starting with Baldwin is because I think Heschel and King have a lot more in common. They were interlocutors. One of the Heschel piece that we're actually going to look at was from the conference where he met King. And so they're a little bit easier to put into conversation. But Baldwin is a really interesting character here. He was actually the son of a preacher, and had always thought that that was the direction that he was going to go. And for many reasons, sort of there are a great number of reasons he broke with Christianity. He was gay, so that was a big one. But also, his father had been quite critical of him having Jewish friends, and he was really uncomfortable with that. He was like, I don't get how that's Christian. But he became a really interesting figure in sort of seeing how certain Christian themes, especially Christian anti-Semitism, had come to, and sort of that Christianity had obviously justified colonialism and slavery, and how that was continuing to play itself out. So he has this brilliant essay that I go back to constantly because it is just so dense. I talk about Baldwin as a prophet very often, is everything he says, every single line needs to be unpacked, and every single thing he says is just simultaneously poetic and like really powerful. He has this piece, and I'll share the links to all of them at the end of the session, where he talks about how Black folk are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white, which is a really interesting analysis. So I'm just going to read a few clips from it and then spend a little bit of time. If there were more people, I would say, well, let's have a really vibrant discussion. But as it is, let's have a discussion a little bit about what he's doing and how he's responding to religion here. So he says the root of anti-Semitism among Negroes is ironically the relationship of colored peoples all over the globe to the Christian world. This is a fact which may be difficult to grasp, not only for the ghetto's most blasted and embittered inhabitants, but also for many Jews, to say nothing of many Christians. But it is a fact, and it will not be ameliorated. In fact, it can only be aggravated by the adoption on the part of colored people now of the most devastating of Christian vices. He, as you can see, was not a great fan of Christianity. So he continues, there's a whole bunch of stuff. He talks about the role of the Jew in the ghetto as very often being the merchant, the landlord, that, Jews left to the suburbs. And he's quite sarcastic in places. He's like, he talks a lot about how Jews will say, well, no, we can't possibly be racist because anti-Semitism. And he's like, that's ridiculous. So he continues on a little bit. And he says, so he continues down and says, in the American context, the most ironical thing about Negro anti-Semitism is that the Negro is really condemning the Jew for having become an American white man, for having become, in effect, a Christian. The Jew profits, I do not need to answer the phone. I'm going to turn my phone on to do not disturb. I forgot to do that. Okay, that's better. No more ringing. Okay. He says, the Jew profits from his status in America, and he must expect Negroes to distrust him for it. The Jew does not realize that the credential he offers, the fact that he has been despised and slaughtered, so this is the Holocaust illusion, does not increase the Negro's understanding. It actually increases the rage, because it's not here, not now, that the Jew is being slaughtered. And so we're talking like late 60s now. And he's never despised here because he's American. The Jewish travail occurred across the sea, and America rescued him from the house of bondage. But America is the house of bondage for the Negro, and no country can rescue him. What happens to the Negro here happens to him because he is an American. So again, we're starting to see some biblical allusions of, the Jew. You can imagine this idea of the house of bondage, of course, Egypt. He's drawing an allusion there that the Jew leaves. The Black community is still in Egypt, but told that they're free. He continues quite a bit, but then he goes a little bit back into this critique of Christianity, that the Jew is playing in Harlem the role assigned to him by Christians long ago. He is doing their dirty work. So the idea of Jew as middleman that pops up in the New Testament and continues on through early Christian anti-Semitism. And then he sort of continues, and essentially it's really a deep indictment of Christianity, but he's also writing this to the Jewish community, saying that you have to understand Christian anti-Semitism. You have to understand that in America, you are not in the place that had slaughtered you. This is the place that brought you in as refugees later, and really trying to encourage some reflection on the part of everyone here, couched in this really deep criticism of Christianity. So really, he's taking this sort of departure from Christianity as the place where he pins so much of his analysis of oppression and of intercommunal strife. That the way he ends this is that the crisis taking place in the world and in the minds and hearts of Black men everywhere is not produced by the Star of David, but by the old rugged Roman cross on which Christendom's most celebrated Jew was murdered, and not by Jews. So this is the church's fault, right? He's very clear that this is the church's fault. Now, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. does not blame the church. But what he does is his texts are like peppered with biblical allusions everywhere. And so I tried to find some where he is a little bit more explicit. And there's a few places where he's extremely explicit, and we're going to come to in allusions, but they're very explicit allusions. And then there are places where he really is using this idea of like, you call yourselves religious, you're hypocrites, to sort of spur forward action. So, and we're going to see that come up with Heschel a little bit as well. So just starting there, and so I'll go through the letter from Birmingham jail a little bit, and then hopefully we can pause and discuss a little bit what we're seeing happening between these two. So this is earlier, this is 1963. And he's talking about, he's sitting in a jail cell writing a letter. He says, sometimes the law is just on its face and unjust in its application. And so the whole thing is that he was, on the one hand, he was exercising his First Amendment rights. On the other hand, he was thrown in jail for parading without a permit. So he says there's nothing wrong with an ordinance that says you can't parade with a permit, but without a permit rather. He says, but it's unjust when it's used to maintain segregation and deny citizens peaceful assembly and protest. So he says, in no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. So now here's where he brings biblical sources in, both Jewish and Christian. He says, of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions, excruciating pain of chopping blocks, rather than to submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. He says, Socrates is to thank for academic freedom and the Boston Tea Party. And why is he doing this? He says, I must confess that over the past years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. This is the famous line. He says, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And so he's tying, of course, this sort of idea of the white moderate to the people who sat on the wrong side of all of these biblical sort of allusions. And he says, lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice. And so he's really sort of going deep in the, I sort of say this facetiously, he's guilting religious people quite profoundly here and saying, wake up, like you're on the wrong side. And he continues and says, so you're saying that our protests are extreme. He's like, I'm a little surprised. They were peaceful, they're civil disobedience. He's just given all these examples of civil disobedience. And he says, was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. And he continues through and then ties it to Protestantism and then to American politics. And so he says, perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. And so he's really trying to sort of show that these prophetic traditions that Jews, Christians come from, and this is predominantly aimed at Southern Christians, are these instances of these so-called extremists, and that you can't put yourself on the wrong side of this and then say that you're a religious person and that you're on the side of justice. So again, really sort of taking religion as a way to sort of throw back in people's faces what is happening. Very differently, of course, than Baldwin. Baldwin's rejecting religion. MLK is embracing it. But I think, very interesting to see, also, like, keeping in mind that especially in the Black community at that time and in the Southern white community, the church would have been a familiar lexicon for all of them. This is deeply religious communities. So I want to pause for a second. I don't really have like a discussion question so much as like any reflections on how these texts are being used and how these sort of traditions are being pulled into this.
Don't everybody raise their hand at the same time. Well, can I give you my reaction? It was quite in response to your question, but what impresses me is these guys can talk. They can talk and they can write. They're eloquent,
Extremely.
There is such a torrent of words over these topics nowadays, and half of it, more than half of it, is just incoherent. Not incoherent is maybe too strong, but it's just it doesn't communicate the passion. It doesn't communicate the detail. It gets lost in jargon. When you use weak language to describe strong issues, you sort of trivialize them. Maybe you didn't intend to, but, and it's too much to expect everybody to be James Baldwin or Martin Luther King. But some of the people who speak and write about this, they really should take, some course on rhetoric or something. I don't know. I won't go on too much about this thing because I'll become repetitive, but there's some buzzwords I hear, they just drive me nuts. They've been used so much, they've lost all meaning. Like performative. Can't stand that word. If you mean to say that people are all talk and no action, then say so. But performative? That wasn't even a word 5 years ago, I don't think. All of a sudden it's on everybody's lips. The other thing, there's an awful lot of placing things in an American context there. The Boston Tea Party, the First Amendment, America being a house of bondage. I understand there are Americans writing about their situation. The problem when we invoke these passages here is we're putting them on the other side of the pane of glass, so to speak. The implicit thing is that's a problem somewhere else, not here. I think we don't have a James Baldwin. Well, we need to work harder to find Canadian language.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise you don't engage people, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I think one of the big challenges, I talk a lot when I do training here predominantly, because so much of the language, like you've been gesturing at, there's all this sort of vocabulary and language, is really from an American context. And so much of the idea of what anti-racism is from an American context. I spend a lot of time sort of unpacking, like, here's the differences. And there are some really key differences. And one of the things that makes it really challenging is that we don't have the same kind of a Black community. We have an immigrant Black community that came mostly from Commonwealth countries later. Through the 60s, 70s, and then through family reunification schemes. So we have a really different relationship that people tend to forget that we also had slavery and that there are historic Black communities in Canada, but they're a tiny proportion of an already relatively small community. So it's really interesting because, I work on both sides of the border. All this, I go back and forth in theory. I'm actually going to New York on Friday. It's the first trip I'm taking since March 2020. It's a little scary, but that's neither here nor there. I can finally be like, I travel often again. I think the way that these things hit are very different in the US, where people really feel that they're walking on this tradition, to here where we didn't have, we had some stuff out on the East Coast, but we had very little sort of civil disobedience of this sort in Ontario and things like that, because we didn't have the same segregationist laws. I think the Canadian exceptions to the rule would be Nova Scotia. So it's an interesting dilemma when like looking at civil rights era text, is that there isn't Canadian civil rights era text, and at the same time reminding ourselves that these legacies exist here as well. The history might look different, but the legacies are here. And yeah, things I think about all the time. Okay, so before we move to Heschel, which really is the bulk of what I want to talk about today, is this one always like gets to me. This is a really famous Martin Luther King speech that he gave the night before he was assassinated. And so he's giving this speech. They're going to do a protest the next day in Memphis. They did do a protest the next day in Memphis. And this is sort of his like rile up speech. He's getting everyone excited and amped up, and it's called "I've Been to the Mountaintop." So we can guess two biblical allusions there, right? There are two characters, one from the Jewish tradition, one from the Christian tradition, where "I've been to the mountaintop" is symbolic. Of course, I'm talking about Moses and Jesus. So he says, "It's all right to talk about long white robes over yonder in all of its symbolism, but ultimately people want some suits and dresses and shoes to wear down here." So he's like, salvation is not for over there. It's all right to talk about streets flowing with milk and honey, but God has commanded us to be concerned about the slums down here and his children who can't eat 3 square meals a day. If you follow Martin Luther King's trajectory at all, by the end of his life, he was pretty much embracing socialism. He became even more public enemy #1 of the American government because he became vocally anti-Vietnam and was embracing socialism and was about to launch the Poor People's Campaign. So he says, it's all right to talk about the New Jerusalem, but one day God's preacher must talk about the new New York, the new Atlanta, the new Philadelphia, the new Los Angeles, the new Memphis, Tennessee. This is what we have to do. So again, he's saying, wake up to my clergy friends. We can talk about all this salvation, but people are suffering here and now. This is where it gets like really depressing to me. This is where the "I've been to the mountaintop" comes from. It says, well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And he was assassinated the next day.
Yeah.
Like, he wrote this knowing that there were credible threats against his life. So, you know, it's not like he was like, it was prophetic in the sense of like seeing something that was unforeseen. But there's something, I think, you know, he's clearly making this parallel to the fact that Moses did not go into the promised land. And so, you know, for me, this one also like makes me cry half of the time if I kind of forget how it ends. Because I think there's something you can think about all of the ways that he passed the torch on to Joshua, the ways in which Ralph Abernathy, John Lewis, all of these other people who became the leaders of the movement after he was assassinated. And you can also see the ways in which he's trying to draw that parallel very clearly, again, in a religiously educated crowd's mind, that even if he's gone, the promised land is still there for them to get to. And so, you know, again, simultaneously using religious source, and here it's an illusion, as his inspiration, and also as, in this case, less as he uses it in both ways, right? He's got the sort of pushing people forward piece about like, okay, like stop talking about salvation over there. We got to talk about the realities on the ground here. And also in constructing this narrative of of what will it look like if he's gone. Yeah, this one always, I read it again today and I was like, I think I'm gonna cry. It's just, if it's kind of like, I always think of this very often, the kind of famous last words phenomenon, where if you are a public figure, you usually have a last speech. So, of course, Jack Layton did not say sunny ways on his deathbed. He probably had prepared those words long before. And, thinking of those things, those sort of famous last words that really stick with people. But what's really powerful here is that he was able to sort of inspire the movement to keep going, even when he knew that he probably was not going to be there with them. So I'm going to switch over to Heschel now. And Heschel, so what we're going to do with Heschel, I will throw the link into the chat. So this is all from one speech. Come on. There we go, chat. Okay. And again, I have it on the screen, so if you prefer to look at the screen share, we can do that. So this is all drawn from a single Heschel speech, which was given at the conference where he met Martin Luther King Jr. So this conference, obviously they were in each other's orbit, but this is where they really began sort of this partnership. And so I've taken a few clips from his speech where he does explicitly use biblical verse. And he has, again, there's allusions all over the place, but and so I think, though, what's really interesting, keep in mind, this is early, this is 1962, I believe. I apparently have, oh, maybe it's here under more info. Yes. 1963. So this is relatively early civil rights movement text. And what's really interesting to me and why I kept the Baldwin in, I was kind of wavering, do I want to keep the Baldwin or not? Because it's so different, is some of the themes that Heschel brings out are things that Baldwin enunciated in a very different context a little bit later. So he says, I love it. This is the beginning. At the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may celebrate a feast to me." While Pharaoh retorted, "Who is the Lord that I should heed his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but is far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to cross certain university campuses. So again, the Exodus narrative just keeps kind of playing itself out in these texts. He continues, "Let us dodge no issues, let us yield no inch to bigotry, let us make no compromise with callousness." He quotes William Lloyd Garrison, that's not really important. And then he says, "Religion and race, how can the two be uttered together? To act in the spirit of religion is to unite what lies apart, to remember that humanity as a whole is God's beloved child. To act in the spirit of race is to sunder, to slash, to dismember the flesh of living humanity. Is this the way to honor a father, to torture his child? How can we hear the word race and feel no self-reproach?" So he continues on. You can see why, contrary to popular narrative, he wasn't that popular in the Jewish community. He was, there were people, of course, who did flock to him and really thought that he was, a very important figure. But sort of your average, a lot of sort of your average rabbi in the pews, especially in the South, were like, this guy's causing trouble. This is not good for the Jews' position in America. And this is like very true of a number of the civil rights narrative is a lot more complicated than sort of the Jews were on the side of the civil rights movement. That being said, disproportionately as a minority group, the Jews were disproportionately involved in the civil rights movement and were very successful fundraisers for example, Martin Luther King's nonviolent action and things like that. So it's a both and situation. So he says, race is a normative legal or political concept capable of expanding to formidable dimensions. He says, as a standard of values and behaviors, it operates as comprehensive doctrine as racism. And this is what I love. He says it's worse than idolatry. Racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil. He's really harsh. And I think we'll understand why in a second here. He says, few of us realize that racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum hatred for a minimum of reason, the maximum of cruelty for a minimum of thinking. Perhaps this conference should have been called Religion or Race. You cannot worship God and at the same time look at man as if he were a horse. So I think, we're seeing he starts in this Exodus narrative, but then he kind of extrapolates out, and where is he ending up? I think he's very clearly ending up at God created man in the image of God. So you're actually, by being racist, you are desecrating God. He really goes that far. It's deeply theological for him, which is why he's saying it's worse than idolatry. It is Satanism, because who desecrates God? The Satanists. Idolaters just don't know who they should worship. And so it's very sort of clear there. This is a very long speech, so I've just taken a handful of clips. He also pulls, recognizing this is a multi-faith conference, from any number of the places in the Gospels with the line, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," and he explicitly situates that one in the Word, so in Christian text. And he says, another way of dealing with bad conscience, so, pushing the idea of race out of your mind, is to keep Black people out of sight. And he says, the word proclaims, love thy neighbor, so we make it impossible for him to be a neighbor. Let a Negro move into our neighborhood and madness overtakes the residents. And then there is a quote from a Christian journal that is talking about ghettoization. And so he's saying, he's really drawing heavily on this. Restricted housing is the chief offender. So long as the racially exclusive patterns of suburban America continue, the Negro will remain an exile in his own land. So again, we're really seeing this theme simultaneously of Exodus and of being in bondage in America. And they're playing off of each other constantly. This is like the more I read these texts, the more I see that there is this constant theme and churn of this idea of, especially when you put Black text and Jewish text in dialogue, and Black community and Jewish community in dialogue, this constant churn of this idea that the Exodus narrative is the narrative here, but Jews left and Black people stayed. And that is like a tension that keeps playing itself out. So you can see that also with this idea, it came up in Baldwin, right? That actually we didn't read that part of the Baldwin. In the Baldwin text, he talks about Jews moving to the suburbs. The phenomenon of white flight, that Jews were able to access government programs that gave them more mobility to move to the suburbs, the restrictive covenants that were keeping Jews out of suburban housing mostly vanished. And so the integrated neighborhoods that Black people and Jewish people had shared became Black neighborhoods, but the Jewish people who owned businesses in those neighborhoods or owned homes in those neighborhoods kept their business interests in those neighborhoods, or acted as teachers or social workers or something like that. So again, we're seeing this like exodus in the context of American life from poor neighborhoods to the suburbs, to the American dream, and Black people still being sort of trapped in these contexts. The next piece, I'm like, this was me culling text, and I have so much. The next bit really, he obviously, pulls a lot from prophets, because what do prophets do is they hold a mirror, they sort of say it like it is. And he talks a little bit about what is a prophet, actually. And, Heschel was very interested in the idea of who is a prophet, what is a prophet. He wrote a whole book about it. And he pulls from Isaiah, and from Isaiah 1:17, learn to do good, devote yourselves to justice, aid the wronged, uphold the rights of the orphan, defend the cause of the widow. So, this is the role of the Israelites. The translations, of course, never match, but it is what it is. So he says, in a sense, the calling of the prophet may be described as that of an advocate or champion, speaking for those who are too weak to plead their own cause. Indeed, the major activity of the prophets was interference, remonstrating about wrongs inflicted on other people, meddling in affairs which were seemingly neither their concern nor their responsibility. A prudent man is he who minds his own business, staying away from questions which do not involve his own interests, particularly when not authorized to step in. And prophets were given no mandate by the widows and orphans to plead their cause. The prophet is a person who is not tolerant of wrongs done to others, who resents other people's injuries. He even calls upon others to be the champions of the poor. It is to every member of the community, not alone to the judges, that Isaiah directs his plea. So again, he's really saying that the role of the person who shows up for civil rights is to rouse everyone out of thinking it doesn't concern them. And we can, of course, tie it back to the idea that racism, he says, is like the biggest moral blight facing humankind. And so we get this really clear, I talked about it a little bit before, but we get this really clear thing of why is he so upset by racism? Again, he looks to Isaiah, to whom then can you liken God? What form compare to him? And he says, God's covenant is with all men. We must never be oblivious of the equality of divine dignity of all men. The image of God is in the criminal as well as in the saint. How can my regard for man be contingent on his merit if I know that in the eyes of God, I myself may be without merit? And here he's going to contrast, again, we think of the idolatry piece. He says, you shall not make yourself a graven image or any likeness of God. The making and worshiping of images is an abomination. It's condemned. The world and God are not of the same essence. And this is where I think it's, again, really powerful. Why, you remember earlier, he said it's not idolatry, it's Satanism. He says there is something in the world that the Bible does regard as a symbol of God. It's not a temple or a tree, a statue or a star. The symbol of God is man, every man. How significant is the fact that the term tselem, which is frequently used in a damnatory sense for a man-made image of God, as well as the term demut, likeness, of which Isaiah claims, that's in the bit we read, no demut can be applied to God, are employed in denoting man as an image and likeness of God. Man, every man, must be treated with the honor due to a likeness representing the King of Kings. So you can see why for him, this goes beyond idolatry and into an absolute desecration of God, that to regard any human that is created in God's image as less than man is to desecrate the image of God. And then the last, I think it's this the last text that I brought? Yes. So the last piece that I brought is really, he's talking again about the call, and again, taking this back to this idea that religion for Heschel, for Baldwin, and for King, it becomes the mirror to hold up to people, to sort of show them to a degree their own hypocrisy. And he says, humanity can only thrive when challenged, when called upon to answer new demands. Imagine how smug, complacent, vapid, and foolish we would be if we had to subsist on prosperity alone. It is for us to understand that religion is not sentimentality, and God is not a patron. Religion is a demand. God is a challenge, speaking to us in the language of human situation. His voice is in the dimension of history. It says the universe is done, but the greater masterpiece is still undone, still in the process of being created, and that's history. For accomplishing his grand design, God needs the help of man. So we're getting a little bit into Heschel's own theology. He had one of his texts is God in Search of Man. We had that whole bit about the prophets. You can really see sort of his own theological formulations coming through here. He says man is and has the instrument of God, which he may or may not use in consonance with the grand design. So God has a grand design. Man should strive to do everything as God had intended, but man, free will, can decide not to. And he says human beings, instead of fashioning the clay, deform the shape. God needs mercy and righteousness. His needs cannot be satisfied in space. And here's the call: by sitting in pews, by visiting temples, but in history, in time. So showing up to synagogue is not enough to shape history. is within the realm of history that man is charged with God's mission. And he says, this is really his sort of call to action here. He says, people will say, it's too bad. Like, there's nothing I can do. We're too late. It's irreparable. And he is going to say that he responds to that. If that is true, God has spoken in vain. And he continues, okay, so the message is 4,000 years too late, but certain things have happened. And he says, history is not all darkness. It was good that Moses did not study theology under the teachers of that message. Again, we're back to the Exodus. Otherwise, I would still be in Egypt building pyramids. Abraham was all alone in a world of paganism. The difficulties he faced were hardly less grave than ours. And he says, the greatest heresy is despair of men's power for goodness, men's power for love. I'm going to stop sharing. So again, he's really pulling on Exodus, and he's really making it very clear that for him, what I often think of is there's the Midrash in Exodus where they're all standing by the Red Sea and it's not parted yet. And they're like, oh my God, the Egyptians are coming up behind them. And it takes one guy who's like so desperate and scared that he steps into the sea and then it splits, Nachshon. He's saying, like, we all got to be in Nachshon here, right? Like, if we let sort of the paralysis of this is still going on, how can we fix it, really hold us here, we're not hearing what God's trying to tell us. So again, religion and text becomes this opportunity to sort of spur people forward, rather than having people sort of, it's not just inspiration. It's not like God says that we're all created equal, and therefore racism is bad. It's, if you are not acting, you are forsaking God. And that, again, I think, I would put him in the category of a prophet as well. Like, when we really think about what does it mean to be a prophet and the way he defines prophecy, Martin Luther King as well. All three of these guys, actually. Yeah, I have no real like discussion questions, because I thought I would have like a bunch of people and then it would be like question and answer and it would be what it was. I'm not gonna lie, I was surprised that anyone came because Chris Hadfield.
Yeah, there's a lesson to be learned there about scheduling and programming or whatever.
Yeah, well, so, I keep joking. I said to Deanna when we were talking, she was like, you're up against Chris Hadfield. I was like, yeah, I found that out after I said yes.
Yeah.
And it was like, great, what else is going on? Oh, Chris Hadfield and like David Besmos gets like, it's a really packed session of good stuff. Anyhow, but anytime I get to ramble about civil rights is a good moment for me anyway, so it's fine.
No, you know what, and if you're going to redo this before another audience, it's going to be a great program. It is. Thank you. I will tell you an Abraham Joshua Heschel story, sort of vaguely relates to your experience today, which is that about 15 years ago, Rabbi Jason Rosenberg, I think you may not have been here at that time. I don't know. He was a rabbi. No,
but I do know who he was.
He's now the rabbi at Beth Am in Florida. And he was doing a program about Abraham Joshua Heschel. And at the same night, the Schwartz Reisman Center was sponsoring some, I don't even remember his name, some star speaker in the sanctuary. And I went out to Rabbi Rosenberg's program, and there were 3 of us, and that was it. And it's not easy to talk about Heschel. You need to know your stuff. And he'd put a lot of work in, and he was just, he said, I can't just go hear the others. And I said to him, because I was the president of Brotherhood at the time, I said, well, maybe we'll redo this as a Brotherhood program. We'll promote it. We've got our own mailing list and so on, and we'll find a better date and so on. And we did redo it later in the year, and we got 40 people.
There you go.
And for what it's worth, the Brotherhood Study Group, now the pandemic has upset everything, but we're now in our 15th year of having a rabbi come and speak to us for 4 or 6 sessions once a year.
It's great.
So, you'll find your audience. You have many times before, and you will again, right?
Yeah, and this is something I'm actually, so this theme of this theme of like Exodus and like what happens when you're freed but you're forced to stay in the place is something like I don't know if I assume if they invited me to submit an application to teach, it's because they want me to teach at this program called Amud, the Jews of Color Torah Academy.
And I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, it's New York based, but everything is virtual right now, obviously. But I mean, like everything else, the pandemic is going to shift all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And they'll probably keep doing virtual because they're getting a North America wide community now. But they emailed me on Tuesday and they're like, were you planning to submit? And I was like, I was not, but I feel like if you're asking me that, you're asking me to submit. So what I submitted was something about, it's three sessions. And this is something that I've really been interested in workshopping because, for so much, I'm really interested right now in the ways in which sort of within how Black Jewish dialogue breaks down, essentially, right? Like Jews will show up and say, but we're oppressed too. And the Black community will say, well, that didn't happen here, and so on and so forth. And
a part of the example of Heschel is, we know what he went through, but he doesn't bother to invoke that, Right. He's really a selfless character, at least really in that passage, And there's a bit of a lesson. He doesn't enunciate it, but there's a lesson there to be a bit more like him, maybe.
Yeah, and there's something, if I can find this book, it's probably right behind me. Yep. Drop my Kamala Harris action figure. Okay.
Oh no, there is one.
I have a little assortment of political action figures behind me. But one of my absolute favorite essays.
I gotta ask, is she a bobblehead?
No, I wish she was. I'll show you. She is. She's like literally an action figure. I also have Elizabeth Warren, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and RBG. My mother also bought me Trump, but I refused. I gave Trump back to her. I mean, the Trump one is a joke. Like, he's giving the middle finger and he's like bright red. Like, it's a joke, okay. But I was like, I don't want him in my apartment. Please take him away. But one of my favorite civil rights era texts, like altogether, and actually the Baldwin is in this book as well, is this book, Black Anti-Semitism and Jewish Racism. Mm-hmm. It's from 1969, I believe. Yeah, 1969. And Al Vorspan, who founded the Religious Action Center, has this. He was a very sarcastic man, and he was like a true activist. He was getting arrested in protests in the South along with the rest of them. And he says, he's talking about this, it's called Blacks and Jews. And he says, both Black anti-Semitism and Jewish racism are unfortunate shibboleths. There are some Blacks who are anti-Semitic, but there's no such thing as Black anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism does not inhere in Blackness as it does, for example, in Christianity. See, this lovely, everything comes full circle. And he says, well, indeed, there are Jews who are racist. Judaism stands against racism. Indeed, it's doubtful that Jews can be categorized as white as a visit with Oriental, North African, and other dark-skinned Jews in Israel, or Black Jews in New York City, for that matter, will demonstrate. So pretty ahead of his time. He's writing this in like the mid-60s, saying like, okay, there are white Jews and there are not white Jews. Like, we can't talk about it like this. But he continues, I have to see if I can find this one line because I know where it is. It's on a source sheet that I've done for a different class. Give me 1 second to pull it up. He has this one line that just actually makes me laugh every time, specifically about Jews and sort of trying to frame our oppression as the reason that we can't be racist or whatever it might be. And he says, and so he's situating it again in white flight. He says, the flood of Jews to suburbia has left another problem which exacerbates Black-Jewish relations. The existential human contacts between Jews and Negroes in the inner city are now merchant, customer, landlord, tenant, social worker, client. These are inherently tense, unequal relations. They are fraught with conflict and resentment. Jews in the core neighborhoods are represented by landlords and pawnbrokers and small merchants. And then he continues, this it is so funny to me, this line. Even if we beat every Black anti-Semite into the ground with a 2x4 marked, remember the 6 million, will we eliminate anti-Semitism? He says, what we must do about it is not exhaust ourselves with symptoms, but deal with the root problems which spawn hatred and violence and frustration. Until we deal with the misery of the slums, until we eliminate unemployment and underemployment, until we deal with the terrible plight of powerlessness, until we humanize our monstrous welfare system, until we deal with the social problems of the American city, there will be anti-Semitism, and there will be every other kind of prejudice and every other kind of antisocial fury. I personally find this one like meaningful on so many levels. One is, of course, the reform movement connection, Al being the founder of what is now the RAC. He's also he passed away just before the pandemic, I think, actually, sometime in the last couple of years. And he was, I'm trying to think, he was honored at Biennial in Boston, which would have been 2017. So sometime between 2018 and 2020, he passed away. And he was actually one of my good friend's grandfather, which I did not know until Biennial in Boston, which was very funny. I had always wondered, because Vorspan's not a common last name, and Ben, my friend, is like very social justice-y and like talked about how he got it from his grandfather, and I was like, I didn't grow up in the reform movement. I didn't know anything about the RAC or anything like that. So, you know, but this text, though, is just so, again, he's talking, again, so much about this idea of place and this idea of where did the oppression happen and what is the position, what is the rootedness, what is happening here and now in the land that we're living in, and is that our Egypt? Right?
If we're talking about here and now, can I bring up another name?
Mm-hmm.
Anna Paul.
Yep.
She wraps up in one frame everything in a way.
Yeah.
And I don't quite understand what's roiling the Green Party so much, but part of it is Israel, and the opposition that she's facing, which has got to be irrational mostly because she hasn't had much of, this is her first election. It's not like she's failed as a leader. Has to be partly racist and partly anti-Semitic, right? And somehow these people seem, I don't know what we make of it, but I don't feel that story's been told yet.
There was a really good piece not long before the election call, and I want to say it was in the Globe. It was a paper that I don't usually read for politics, so it was either the Globe or the Post. Might have even been the Post, because I remember being like, this is an unexpected thing. That was basically like, this is ridiculous, watching the Green Party implode on the eve of an election call over what is essentially a social media fight about Israel. And it was like, basically said some of that stuff, like, this is only possible because the leader is Black and Jewish.
Yes.
That, you know, she's being sort of pinned as the angry Black woman and as the Jew who's going to do anything to support Israel all at once. And like, all of this just came to a head over a staffer's social media post. I wonder if I can find it. It was a really well done article. I'm typing in some keywords to Google to see if I can. Yeah, I don't know if I'll be able to find it with all the other election coverage.
You have my email, right?
I probably do, but maybe just throw it in the chat and I will look for it.
All right. Where's the chat? Here it is. You can send it to me if you want to. If not, I'll probably
if I can find it. I might not find it, but I'm going to try.
This didn't work. Hang on. What did I do here? That's me.
Awesome. Okay. I'm going to try and get it to work. Or I have to remember, it would be helpful if I remembered which paper it was in, because then it would be faster to find. But ridiculous.
Oh, anyway.
Yeah, just really.
So,
yeah.
You know, it has implications. These, I don't know. There's a Canadian story that runs adjacent to, but not quite the same channels as the American story or the Heschel story, which is basically a global story, sort of,
right.
Or the Palestinian-Israeli story, or the
yeah.
You know, you probably bring in more. South African. There's a Jewish community in South Africa. Everything's local in a way, right?
Yep.
What's that saying? All politics is local.
That's definitely it.
It has to be seen locally. I don't know. But I'll shut up now.
Oh, it's totally fine.
I'll let somebody else talk.
If anyone else wants to talk, I've spoken a lot, so I am.
Tabitha, you're just here to be the Zoom host.
I'm hosting and I'm a fan. So we have by my estimate 10 more minutes. So if we want to make the most of talking to Tema while we have her.
Sure.
I feel like we're keeping you. Tema and I can continue without you.
No.
If you don't want to be here.
No,
I don't know.
I do.
Okay.
I really want to find this article. It's going to make me crazy. Maybe it's this. Is it this? Did I find it? I think it might be this one that's called The Green Party of Canada Slides into Irrelevance. I think that might be it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyhow, it's just silly. We have somebody joining.
Oh my goodness. Somebody CH. I don't know who's CH.
Yeah. I mean
anyway.
Yeah, so I mean what I'll say is I think the interesting thing, CH is gone. I wonder if that was my mother. I told my mom not to come, so that might have been. My mother has a bad habit of mostly in real life, because Zoom it's harder to slip in unnoticed, but of like sticking her head in the door to things I've told her not to come to. So that could have been her. I don't know, but no, because I don't know if she knows how to change her name. Not gonna lie.
I don't know how to change mine either. I heard what you said at the beginning, but I thought I don't see that control here, on-screen control here. I think I got to log out to change my name, but anyway, that's another issue.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that is really interesting to me now is that because there's been so much attention paid to sort of civil rights era Black Jewish sort of alliance, there's been an equal amount coming out that sort of complicates the narrative a little bit. As you know, the story that gets told, the American sort of story that gets told is, you know, Jews and the Jewish community and the Black community were side by side, and Jews were fighting for the rights of Black people, and they founded the NAACP and the Urban League and blah 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 blah. And then you know, civil rights movement happened, and at some point the Black people kicked the Jews out and became anti-Semitic. That's kind of the narrative, right? That's, I mean, oversimplified, but that's kind of the narrative that gets told, and sometimes it gets told in ways that are a little bit even more problematic than that very simplified narrative, which is like, after all we did, they turned around and became anti-Semitic. And of course, like, this is a response to the rise of Black Power. It's not coming out of left field. Like, the leaders of SNCC said some really anti-Semitic stuff. That's real life. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. But it sort of ignores these broader trends of simultaneously there's, laws, civil rights era laws come into force and Jews benefit from them and the Black community doesn't. So there's like this resentment that gets built up. But also Mark Dollinger, who's a professor, USF, I think, University of San Francisco, wrote a brilliant book that's called Black Power, Jewish Politics, that sort of complicates this whole idea that the Jewish community thought Black Power was a bad thing. And he talks a little bit about like places where the Jewish community actually took inspiration from the Black Power movement. And it's really unexpected places. Some of it is there was a lot of interplay between the Jewish community's growing Zionism and Black Power, and taking sort of lessons on how to push that forward from each other, number one. But also, like, they talk a lot about, I think of this one really often, like, he went into the ADL's archives and has pulled up all this stuff on, like, what were they doing as, the Nation of Islam is growing. And of course, we're anti-Semitic. And the ADL's attitude was like, don't feed the trolls. And there's so much, and you'll notice, like, the ADL still kind of doesn't feed the trolls when it comes to Farrakhan. But I mean, a lot of other people do. But it's really interesting sort of reading this and also thinking about some of the things that happened in, like, he talks a little bit about the sort of the rise of identity politics in the 60s and some of the things that came out of it in the Jewish community, like the day school movement, which, he says,
fighting segregation in a way, or
yep.
for continuing segregation.
Exactly.
Because if you send your child to a Jewish school,
you don't have to worry about it.
it's going to be in 99+%.
Yeah, and so it worked really well. They're integrating the schools on the one hand, so that, and Jews are, as a value system, very in support of school integration. And they're worried that their kid's school is going to go downhill. And there's the identity politics piece of like, well, actually Jewish education is important to us now and preserving Jewish culture. So it's like the perfect place where all of this meets. I said this in a session once, maybe at Hadassah. It was either at Hadassah or at the Women of Reform Judaism conference. And like, people were so mad in the chat. I'm like, no, like, this isn't me coming up with it. This is like a historian finding the documents that talk about it. Like, this isn't like...
Yeah, so can we throw in another Canadian event, right, on the campus of Ryerson University, right? And I'm never there, so maybe I've got this wrong because I'm just consuming media. But on the one hand, a laudable movement to change the university's name, but at the same time, active groups there that will say Zionism is racism.
Yep.
If you drew a Venn diagram, the people who voice those two opinions, I don't. Would there be a lot of overlap? It's an unanswered question, but and I shouldn't speculate. But you know how I would speculate.
Yeah, I found the article, and I remember why I was like, "This is what I'm agreeing with." It's Konrad Jakubowski in the Globe and Mail. There's the link.
Well, thank you.
It's a subscriber only thing, but there might be a way around it, or if you have a subscription.
I'm gonna put that, copy that, and paste that over here. And we're out of time.
I have a question.
Yeah,
that is sort of, I see a lot of back and forth about, in the same vein of pink washing, but using a lot of Beta Israel people that are sort of success stories, and Israel sort of using that as like, I don't want to say propaganda, but like as a look at us being progressive, like they have such a better life here. Is that something that is, I'm just wondering about like that sort of like,
yeah,
propagation, like it's helpful, like at whatever cost, we're like, is that helping the Jews of color?
I don't think so, because I mean, for all sorts of reasons. One is that generally speaking, the sort of Jews of color that Israel holds up, where like there's no racism here, either are saying like there's no race, they're like, Israel diaspora relations when it comes to the conversation about Jews and race are like is extremely broken. And so, you know, you have like somebody who's Ethiopian Jew saying like, I don't experience racism. And then people in diaspora will be like, see, there's no racism, which is terrible. Second of all, all my like lefty cards, like I'm a Zionist, but I'm like on the very progressive end. I hang out with the New Israel Fund. I mean, I'm on the board of New Israel Fund, like cards on the table. It's kind of easy to figure out where I stand here. I mean, I personally think that the Hasbara industry is broken. My inclination is to agree. There's one of my favorite Israeli journalists is a British Israeli guy named Anshel Pfeffer. He writes for Haaretz, but he also wrote a biography of Netanyahu. Really smart guy. And he wrote this article that I go back to really often that is like, enough with the Hasbara. Like, countries that exist shouldn't be spending this much money defending their right to exist. Like, you're actually just feeding the people that say you have no right to exist the longer you go out and say we have a right to exist. Like, you don't see other countries out there doing this. This is not a good idea. All Hasbara is doing is speaking to the people who already believe that Israel has a right to exist. Like, it's not, you know, like I think of sort of the campus events defending Israel or whatever. It's a bunch of Jewish kids who show up, and like I think it's important for them to build community when they're feeling under siege by anti-Zionists, sure, but like don't position it as defending Israel. It's not. It's talking to each other about Israel. So I'm like, I knew some of those kids when I was first a Jewish professional. So I think it's a really interesting phenomenon, but I think, you know, I don't think it's like, I mean, I struggle with the pinkwashing thing as well. It's like, no, it's true. Like, Israel does have better rights for LGBTQ community. Like, that's real. And Israel is extremely diverse. I just find it bizarre to, like, having spent time there, that they're like, oh yeah, no, we're fabulously diverse. There's no racism here. And then you go to Israel and every security guard checking bags outside a restaurant that you see is Ethiopian. And the education rate is like all of the markers of systemic racism. I'm like, yeah, there are some Ethiopians who are doing great, and there's still a lot of poverty. You know, was it 2 summers ago? Yeah, 2 summers ago, there was like the huge Black Lives Matter movement in Israel where they shut down the highway. And like that one made me laugh because it was like all these people who are sort of liberals or progressives or whatever in Israel being like, yes, their protests are so important. And then like the longer the highway was blocked, they were like, okay, but like, let us through. This is really inconvenient now. And I'm like, you know, thinking back to sort of all these things of like, in those civil rights era texts that we read, it's like so typical. It's like, yes, valiant. Oh, we are now inconvenienced. Not valiant, radical. Get out of the road. So I think I don't know, it's really tricky to me because on the one hand, you do, like when I lived in Israel, you walk around and you see Jews that look all sorts of ways. And that's real. And there's still a structural racism problem, which is not just against the Black community. Like, and it's not just an Arab Israeli issue. Like, Mizrahi Jews, generally speaking, have less than Ashkenazi Jews. And those are real challenges in Israel. I guess my biggest issue with like the Hasbara industry, and I use that term really loosely, is like, Israel's a country with problems like any other country. Stop pretending that it's like, and they'll like give lip service to like, Israel's a country with problems just like any other. But now listen to how there's no racism at all. And I'm like, like, it's just not real. So that's my 10 cents. I also think in the sense that people will look and say like, well, that Israeli Black woman says that there's no racism, therefore there's no racism. It is giving people a convenient way to hide their hide from the realities. You know, the Jews of Color Initiative study just came out. 80% of Jews of color in America say that responded to the survey, and it was over 1,300 respondents say that they've experienced racism in a Jewish space. So we have a problem.
Well, thank you so much, Tema. I feel like we could keep talking for a
I
long
can
time
talk forever. I am losing my voice though, so
and we very much appreciate that. I'm mindful though of there possibly being a next session, so I'm going to end it here. Thank you very much.
Tema.
Yeah, thank you for coming, and Howard, thanks for staying and participating.
Oh no, this was my choice, you know.
I'm glad. Thank you.
Yeah. Astronauts are a dime a dozen.
Yeah.
but we only have one of you, so.
It's true.
And I know you, right?
It's true. It's true.
And I was wondering where, like I used to. You're not at Holy Blossom anymore, so I'm glad you're doing this.
Once the building is reopened again, it will be one of my offices away from home, probably. So,
oh, okay.
Yeah, but you know, we got to get to a place where we can.
Yeah.
Okay. The same space. Nice to see you.
Thank you both.
To see you, Tabitha.
Absolutely. You too. Shana Tova, everyone.
Shana Tova. Yes.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.